Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Book Sandwich Den. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rebecca Harrison, and I'm the manager of adult services here at Central Library. I'm so very excited to help out this spring by introducing our wonderful lineup of speakers. Thank you to the Friends of the Tulsa City-County Libraries for supporting today's program. If you'd like more information about how to become a friend of the library, visit tulsalibrary.org/friends. If you have any questions throughout today's program, please feel free to put those in the chat. Our speakers today will answer audience questions following their presentation. And now I would like to welcome today's presenters, Mark Cotner and Sarah Davis. Mark is the reference librarian at the Herman and Kaiser Library, part of the Tulsa City-County Library system. He received his undergraduate degree in political science, specializing in Soviet politics, from Cameron University in Lawton, Oklahoma, and his master's of library and information sciences from the University of Oklahoma. He is a senior judge of nonfiction books for the Oklahoma Book Awards. Mark provides reference and readers advisory services to customers of all ages at HKK. He co-leads with youth librarian Sarah Davis, Creative Truths, a history book discussion, an active and thriving book discussion since August 2018. Sarah Davis is the youth librarian at the Herman and Kaiser Library, part of the Tulsa City-County Library system. She received her undergraduate degree in Children and Family Ministries at John Brown University and her master's in Library and Information Studies at OU Tulsa. She has been published in Tulsa Kids, the Cardigan Newsletter, and the Library School student blog Hack Library School. While her primary focus is services to children through weekly Build-A-Reader story times for families, a monthly book club for tweens, and outreach to local schools, Sarah works with all ages through programs and services at the library. She co-leads with reference librarian Mark Cotner, Creative Truths, a history book discussion, an active and thriving book discussion since 2018. Although she prefers in-person programming in a safe environment, she has pivoted her programs to virtual platforms, including Creative Truths. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mark and Sarah.
Oh.
Thank you. As you can tell, we worked on those biographies together to make them kind of match. Thank you all for coming today. We're going to talk about the book, and there's a very long subtitle, so I must be prepared. The Woman Who Smashed Codes, a true story of love, spies, and the unlikely heroine who outwitted America's enemies, by Jason Fagone, who is a reporter. And that's one of the things as over the last few years, as we've been leading a historical nonfiction book club, is nonfiction books really like their very long subtitles, because it can tell you a lot through just that subtitle. We learned a lot right there. It's a true story. It's about love. It's about spies. And it's about outwitting America's enemies. But that sometimes can make, when you're sharing the beginning of a title, it's a lot to remember. But to give you a little bit of background on the story, if you don't know, and something that's a little different, than discussing a fiction book, is there's not exactly spoilers in this book because, well, it's history and it's already happened. But this is a story of Elizabeth and William Friedman. They were code breakers during World War II and before. They really laid the foundation for much of spy work throughout from World War II onward. Mark's going to talk a little bit about that. But really the book opens with a line from Jason Fagone. I think that's how his name is pronounced. This is a love story. It's about the relationship between these two people, between Elizabeth and William. The book takes us through their relationship, but also their work for the United States through a lot of different things. The book is really broken up into 3 parts. Riverbank, which is a place where they met. Target practice Riverbank is from 1916 to 1920, where they were really getting their feet wet and learning how to break codes. They didn't have a math background. They had a words and English background. Then target practice moving into 1921 to 1938, a real large window of time there where they were working and honing their abilities on, of all things, gangs and, Al Capone, all that kind of stuff, where they were trying to break codes, all those things. And where they moved on to what the third section of the book, The Invisible War, 1939 to 1945, in which they continued to devote their entire lives to breaking codes, smashing, as the title suggests, the woman who smashed codes, and trying to figure out how the balance between sharing what codes you've broken and sharing the secrets. How we don't want the other side to know that we broke their code, but you want to use the information. And it was a really heavy burden for them. So that's really the stage for this book. It's about a story about these two people, this one, Elizabeth and her husband, William, but also about the United States, about war, and about code breaking. So Mark, do you want to talk some about the major themes of this book?
Sure. First major theme is that the author points out is that code breaking is about noticing and manipulating patterns. And he brings out the point that human beings by our very nature recognize or see patterns in our everyday life, even when we don't realize that that's what we're doing. The difference is that cryptographers have an innate knack to go deeper than just on the surface. William Friedman was a geneticist. He had a PhD in genetics. He was widely heralded in his profession. And Elizabeth was a school teacher, had a degree in English, but she always felt that she was destined for something better or more important than just teaching. As Sarah alluded to, the first section of the book is on, it's called Riverbank, and there was an industrialist by the name of George Fabian who had an acreage in Geneva, Illinois, who was destined to master nature. And so no matter what that looked like, that was kind of his obsession. And he had vast amounts of wealth that he could draw in all kinds of scientists to study whatever they wanted. And he drew in William and Elizabeth to his place. Now, it was Riverbank Laboratories. He created a laboratory for his pet projects. It originally started as for, it turned into code breaking, but it was originally for acoustics. It was designed for the study of acoustics. And it is still in existence, and it's still studying military applications of acoustics. And so therefore you can't go see it, you can't visit it, but it's still there. It's a still operating laboratory. So that was where they came together, and they, Elizabeth was looking for a job in Chicago, and she was about ready to go home. And this George Fabian showed up at the library, at the Newberry Library in Chicago. And he overheard her say something about that she loves Shakespeare. And so he basically said, would you like to come home with me? I think I might have a job for you of interest. And she said, oh, okay. So she gets in this limousine, and they drive all the way up to Geneva, Illinois. And long story short, he pairs her up with a lady named, forgot her first name, but it's Gallup. And basically what he was drawing people in at that time was to prove that Shakespeare's work were not done by Shakespeare, but by Francis Bacon.
Dun, dun, dun.
So they were matching, basically they were trying to look at the way that the letters, he felt that there were a code in the writings, in the actual writings of Shakespeare's works, that Francis Bacon created a code to let people know that it was really him and not Shakespeare that produced these works. So that's how she first got up to Riverbank. William was already there. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, and also her entry into this was English. Her entry into this was literature, not, you know, a mathematical foundation. It was about the words. And that's really a big highlight of this book, talking about the words and patterns.
Right. And so that's where that started. Then they moved on from Riverbank. I think William continued to work on cryptographic work for the government. I think.
And how would you define cryptographic for our audience? I know it's in the book, but because
Well,
if you want to read this book at the beginning, he defines, Jason Fagone defines his terms. But how for this, what does cryptographic work?
cryptographic work is just about noticing and manipulating patterns. That's the basic thing.
All it is.
That's all it is. As I said before, we do it without even thinking that we notice patterns. And we're wired to find these patterns. So basically cryptography is just noticing and manipulating the patterns. And he spends mostly in the second section of the book about, not to get too deep in the weeds, but all kinds of transposing and substitutions and the mathematical way that letters, that you can make codes. One part is that while William was still working for the government, Elizabeth was, she was not actively working. She was brought in by the Coast Guard because they needed help during Prohibition, because Al Capone and Lucky Luciano and those guys were bringing by boat from Canada illegal liquor. And so they were letting their tenders that came out to the bigger boats know when they were going to be there and where. And so they were giving it in real basic code by telegraph. And so they needed help. And so she figured out the key to these codes and help them, the Federal Treasury Department, know where the boats would be offloading the liquor onto the tenders, and then when they were going to come ashore. Side
And
note,
that was really the next step from, you know, their work on the farm, the acreage,
right,
of this, okay, learning how, let's see what secrets we can find, what patterns we can find in Shakespeare's work, etc. Moving on to working with the Coast Guard, all of this setting them up for doing more work to as war started to
coming. And as he was wont to do at the time, J. Edgar Hoover was amassing power at a lightning speed, and he took credit for code breaking for the illegal liquor, to help with other Treasury agents. And so he kind of stole. Wasn't the first time that he had done that, but that was.
he took the credit.
He took the credit. And then when we get to World War II, William is tasked to work with different military intelligence for the Navy and the Army. Elizabeth goes to the Navy, but because she's a woman, they put her under another officer. And so kind of at the beginning was kind of chafing to her. But then the work to some degree took over, and they worked. Now, in the middle of World War II, William had a breakdown. He showed up at an institution to rehab himself. And when he came out, of course, he wasn't the same in the sense of that. And it became, the story really became how Elizabeth and William really worked together from that
That's
point.
that's what I was about to say, is like, let's talk about, because this book opens with, this is a love story.
Story.
It feels like the intro to a TV show or a movie. It's like, this is a love story. Let's talk about their relationship and how they work together. We discussed this book actually on Saturday with our Creative Truths book club, and we talked about this topic, and one of our members really talked about, she used the word symbiotic, which was a great word for this. They had a symbiotic
relationship
in the way that they would talk about the codes and the way they would work together. Let's talk more about that.
Yeah. So after he got out of the mental institution, the rehab, there were times that William relied upon Elizabeth more than he had before. The author mentions that William was I guess it really showed now, was a troubled genius.
Yes.
It took Elizabeth to help him symbiotically, but also as just not a wife, but as a colleague. And so she took on more of the weight as going forward. William, his big claim to fame is the fact that he laid the foundation for modern surveillance techniques. The textbook that intelligence officers at the National Security Agency use today is the same textbook that he wrote 60 years ago.
Yeah.
So a lot of the precepts,
the foundations, the basics,
they are still teaching those today. So, I just think that their insights, both of them, and separately and together, is the basis for everything from huge government agencies to even our own online lives today. A lot of their precepts. I think this book is very well written in that it's not like some other books about code breakers where they spend a lot of time with the nuts and bolts of cryptography, because they also, besides the main characters, they also spend a lot of time developing or showing insight into, like, George Fabian and J. Edgar Hoover and some of these other people, and a lot of our folks that are in our book club really appreciated that. It just didn't focus on one person.
Yeah, it's not a biography really by any means. It uses William and Elizabeth Friedman's story as the through line to talk about all these other issues and all these other things happening. So you have that anchor of time and the anchor of, these are the people we're following. But yes, it really does a great job of talking about the broader context of what work they were doing and what was happening outside. Because I think a lot about one of the because there's many people, like when it talks about her using the phrase like smashing codes, she really was smashing them, because she was literally able to break them apart and get these codes and these messages in from these different places and lay them bare and figure out not just what these individual messages meant, but the broader context and the broader how that cipher worked. Because when you're getting in all these different codes and messages from these different places, you have to figure out what the code is. And that is also what the book does a good job of, is explaining to you the broader concepts of how they were doing it without necessarily nuts and bolting. Well, here's exactly how it worked. Because for someone like me, I'd be like, I'm not interested in, I don't need to know everything. I just need to know what we're talking about. I think it's a parallel to another book we'd read for our Creative Truths. I think spring 2019, more or less. We read Code Girls, about other women code breakers in the United States. And that one is another example of like a broader history. Like Elizabeth Friedman is mentioned in that book, but it's talking about in that one, like the Army versus the Navy and the two different sets of codes. But that's another, if you read The Woman Who Smashed Codes or have already read it and are looking for more, it's another great look at that, but from a more like American perspective. And I feel like this book is taking a little bit more of a global perspective and really taking in what else was going on. I think especially in the section about World War II specifically, there is so much of the focus for her was Latin and South America, because that was where it's not something we talk about a lot or know a lot about, but that's where there was, especially in the late 1930s, early 1940s, a real focus on trying to get to the United States through sources in Latin America. And she was, in some ways, in the way the book describes it, like single-handedly responsible for helping make sure that didn't happen. I mean, people on the ground were doing things, but she was the one who was able to interpret the messages and say, this is what's going on, and so we need to actually do something about it. I think we should talk some about the weight of, and the weight, you mentioned William Friedman's breakdown, but the weight of the knowledge of the secrets.
Yeah, and so a lot like intelligence agencies today, the CIA, NSA, they were under a lot of laws that they signed when they signed on to it to protect the secrets, that they couldn't share that information. They couldn't share even with their spouse what they were working on. And so there was a lot of heavy baggage that they carried around because they couldn't share that with anybody. They couldn't talk about it over coffee, talk shop with anybody other than a few people that they saw every day that were working on the same project. So it's amazing. I mean, William Friedman is in his example where he had a nervous breakdown because of that. To some degree, it's amazing that we didn't have more of that during World War II, particularly with just not the signal intelligence folks, but also people that were in the OSS, which was the cloak and dagger folks, and the spies that were all over in Europe and other places of the world.
Which then reminds me again of the book, another book we read for book club, Madame Foucault's Secret War, about one of the spy networks in France, and how, and something I think a lot about when we talk about history, because I know I've mentioned a number of World War II books, so we do talk about other eras. We've talked about lots of different time periods. Keep coming back to this era because there's so much that needed to go right. I don't even know if it's the right way to say it, but there's so many people who had to work together in order to make things happen. Like, for example, like in Madame Foucault's Secret War, getting one person somewhere else, or even in this code breaking, breaking the code, solving the code, so we could get the right answers in the hands of the right people. Again, Madame Foucault's Secret War, one of their claims to fame that is, being heavily involved with codes and messages and secret passing for D-Day. And I think about that, one of William Friedman's weight secrets was I don't know if it doesn't say he knew Pearl Harbor would happen, but there were signs. He had that weight of, well, I could have told you that was going to happen. And just those counterbalances, those weights, and that's what happens in war, especially with code breaking, messaging, all of those things, is how do you weigh whose lives you're going to save? How do you weigh what decisions you are going to make? Not just for you personally, of like, well, I can't talk to my friends about this, but also the decisions you make are life and death for other people.
Yes, and once you break a code, then you can use it to your advantage to find out whether or not they're listening, the enemy is listening to you. A good example is in Midway.
Yes.
We thought that the Japanese had were listening into our codes. And that was verified by the fact that at Midway Island, we made it seem like we had run out of water. And then they started intercepting cables from the Japanese saying, oh, well, they're going to run out of water. So they must be short of other things, which was a total lie, but it was a trial balloon to find out whether or not they were listening to us. So, but I think that it is a really well written book. It's based on a lot of primary sources. There are some areas that are not, and they did have, was it one child or two?
They had two.
Two, which.
So they had a son and a daughter.
That's right. Which doesn't, I don't know. They didn't go into detail about that, about how they kept the secrets from the children.
Well, they were adults by the time
World War II happened.
World War II, because what we're talking, they met between 1916 and 1920 at the target practice season of Al Capone and the Rum Runners, 1921 to 1938, and that's when they were raising their children. So it's not like that was, like a super chill time, because there was a lot going on in the United States between 1921 and 1938.
Right.
By the time we get to like by 1945, their son is deployed somewhere, and their daughter job, like neither of them are in the home anymore.
Right.
Really need to keep secrets from them.
Because she was at home with the kids when the Coast Guard reached out to her.
Yes.
To come help them with the code, because she was doing that while she was trying to break the Rum Runners codes. Yeah, I remember that now.
I'd like to also talk a little bit. We, at our book club on Saturday, we asked our group what their main takeaways were from this book and what they think other people should know. What would encourage someone else to read this book if you're interested in this topic, or if you're not. One of the things that was shared is that you don't have to be a cryptographer to read and enjoy this. Because I think sometimes with nonfiction in general can be very intimidating, that it's, too hard to understand or that it's too complex, but especially when you're talking about these codes and cryptography. Well, I don't understand that, so I can't read that. But that's just really not the case, because the author really takes care to explain what's going on. And once you know the basics, you don't have to know every in-depth piece to understand how to break a code. Again, comes back to the patterns, but also that there's more to the story than just the cryptography. And also, as Mark brought up earlier, that it's about more than one person. It's about the broader context. Another member said, cryptography is more than just math, which I think we've really hammered home a couple of times, especially like talking about words and patterns. But this idea that you don't have to be a numbers person to really get this. And not because, honestly, William and Elizabeth were not numbers people. They were word people. Also, the idea of really brought up a lot of themes of mental health and burnout. Because by the end, we've referenced William's breakdown, but they were working constantly, 12, 14, 16, 18-hour days, no days off for years, and how that really takes a toll on a person, even when you are doing this critically important work. And there were times, but there are kind of hints to me within the story where you could see that Elizabeth was still trying to take care. I mean, they would not have had the language that we use now of like self-care and all of those things. But, there's an anecdote about how she wrote a Christmas letter and updating about the family and everybody, not really mentioning all the other work, but just, hey, this is what's going on. So really trying to cling to some of the things that are normal, even in a world that it's very not normal. And I think for me, one of the overall takeaways from this book is just how much like the code breaking and the messaging, the work that they were doing, Elizabeth and William in particular, but also the women of Code Girls, the women of Bletchley's Circle, other things you've probably heard about in pop culture or your Alan Turing. This control of messaging and breaking the codes was a linchpin. It was essential to the Allies winning that war. And that that story of how he just found Elizabeth, like Fabian found Elizabeth in the Newberry Library and was like, hey, you want to come work with me? Like, somebody else might have risen to the occasion, but they might not have. And just how these little pieces add up to such a bigger and broader story. I think we're running to the end of our time, so I wanted to mention real quick a couple of the different other books like this. Like I mentioned, Code Girls, which is by Liza Mundy. Also, many of you have probably heard of the show Bletchley Circle. I think there's a couple different iterations of that one. Also, The Imitation Game that features Alan Turing, and he's brought up here. And if you watched American Experience last month, was that February or January? Earlier this year, American Experience did a whole feature episode on Elizabeth and William Friedman, but mostly focusing on Elizabeth on the basis of this work. And that was an excellent episode if you're interested in watching that documentary.
We do have some questions from the audience. Let's see what we have here. I did want to remark that I think this is a great pick, especially in light of Women's History Month this month.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Very cool. Let's see. So, any discussion of Woodrow Wilson or the Red Scare? I read Madam President about his stroke and his wife decoded all his telegrams.
They really didn't discuss that. There was not any discussion, I mean, in the book about that. Mm-hmm. It was mainly because they were still at Riverbank when World War I was going on. Mm-hmm. So they weren't anywhere near that at that time. So they didn't, the author doesn't allude to that or anything. So I wouldn't know what to answer that on the basis of what was in the book, because he didn't even venture into that.
Mm-mm.
Okay, so we have another question, and you did touch on this a little bit, Sarah. Do you have any insights into how Elizabeth managed to keep her sanity during the difficult times when she took care of her husband and family and worked in codes?
Yeah, there's some references to it, like I mentioned, but there's also not a lot there. There's things that you can kind of, that I felt like I could pick through and be like, here's a way that she was trying to do that. But there's also a piece of it where it's not that she didn't think that was important, but that she was serving her country and that was the most important thing. That was something that was keeping her sanity, was doing the work. Would you agree with that, Mark?
Yes, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Because, I mean, there's just something about the way, even towards the end of the book, when they're talking towards the end of her life and in the American Experience episode, it's almost like she knows how important it was, but she doesn't really want to talk about it or share about it that much. They had their papers and they had their story, but it was, this is what I did. And I almost think that's a way that she took care of her own sanity, was compartmentalizing it, saying, this is a thing that I did for my country, and that's where it's gonna live. Not because she was very proud of it.
I mean, it's like a lot of World War II veterans. It was just something that they were called to do, and they did it, and they just kind of wanted to move on with their life. I mean, it wasn't like that they obsessed over it after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so someone had asked about the titles that you recommended, Sarah. I know the Bletchley Circle was one of them.
Yeah, I can write those in the chat. Let me.
Okay, great. I was going to try to transcribe them, but if you
I
could
can
do
do
it,
that
that would be great. While you're doing that, I guess I have a question about the current state of cryptoanalysis. Is that still a field? Is it all run by computers now?
It's still, well, it's still.
Yeah, Mark, talk about the computer versus the computer, like a person computing versus.
Oh, well, so yeah, so somebody still has to create the program to break the codes. You still have to have a human element to set up the structure to crack a code. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, with computers, I mean, you're talking about somewhere in the terms of 403 septillion combination permutations. That's like beyond trillions. That's, septillion is, and that's a lot. And so there's no way a human could do those many permutations. And the NSA does have a division that's all that they do is credit. They get these intelligence codes from the Taliban, from, just a few years ago, it was Al-Qaeda, from other groups that are sending things in encrypted formats that they're trying to crack them. And these programs with the computer they run 24 hours a day, all the time, because that's the only way you're going to get to solve those things. But it still starts with a human creating the programs to be able to crack them. So it's a little different that it's, in World War II, it was a combination of rudiment computers versus with pencil and paper. And even to the very end, both William and Elizabeth relied on pencil and paper. Even into the 50s, they were still doing codes or cracking codes by pencil and paper, number 2 pencils and paper. Even when they had help from primitive IBM computers. So it is still an ongoing thing. Each military force has their own intelligence branch, which they use to do that, to jam, to all kinds of stuff, to send codes. So it is still a thing. It's a very important thing, especially now that we have instant communication. They're being sent all the time from phones and everything else.
Yeah. And a book I would recommend, it's not exactly on the topic, but on the topic of what the NSA does, et cetera, is Dark Mirror by Barton Gellman. I'll type that in here. Because it doesn't talk about cryptography specifically, but it's on that same theme.
We have another question. How did he die? Nervous breakdown meant so many things back then. Treatment was usually rest.
Because William Freeman didn't die until the 60s, right?
Right, yes. He died of, let's see here. Trying to remember. He just died of poor health, like in 1969. It was just, I think it was a combination of just old age. It wasn't like a stroke or a heart attack. It was just because he was, he was almost 80 years old when he passed. So, but there wasn't, he had a very fruitful life after he came out of rehabilitation for his breakdown.
Yes, he did. Yeah, because he definitely recovered after that. Maybe not fully to 100%, but he went back to work after that.
Yeah, because that's when he wrote the textbook for surveillance and cryptography that they're still using today. So, so he died of natural causes. It wasn't any, stroke,
Nothing nefarious.
or nothing like that. It was just old age.
Okay, well, we're nearing the end of our time and I'm not seeing any more questions right now. We did have a comment. Thanks so much. Excellent presentation. So
Thanks.
I will just echo that. I really enjoyed it and think that she had a fascinating life.
And if you like reading non-historical nonfiction, we've plugged it a couple times and I'll plug it again. We right now we're doing our Creative Truths, a history book discussion on Zoom on one Saturday morning a month at 9 a.m. If you're interested, you can, it's in our event guide online, events.tulsalibrary.org every month. There's an email you can send an email address you can send an email to, and we'll send you the Zoom link or get you added to our list. Our next title is, I think, one that has been covered by Books Sandwiched in the past. Bad Blood, Secrets and Lies in the Silicon Valley Startup by John Carreyrou, which is a title that Mark and I have been obsessed with since it came out in 2007, it's 2018 or so. And 18, 19, I don't know, in the past. And it's about a Silicon Valley startup. And we'll be doing other titles throughout the year. We'll be talking about the Tulsa Race Massacre in May. We will be discussing Midnight in Chernobyl in June. The Eagles of Heart Mountain, about a Japanese internment camp in July. And The Three Mothers, about the mothers of Martin Luther King Jr., James Baldwin, and I can never remember a third person.
Malcolm X.
Malcolm X, thank you, in August. So we've got if you like discussing historical nonfiction, we got a lot of good titles coming up.
Great. And that's one of the cool things about having these virtual book clubs. Even if you don't live near the branch, you can still participate.
Yeah, we have people who, we actually have gained attendees from outside the Tulsa area. We have somebody who comes from Atlanta now. We have somebody who comes from St. Louis, because that's what we can do now. So that's always fun.
That's just another unique perspective to add to the mix. So
Yes.
that's great. Well, thank you very much, Mark and Sarah. Thank you to everyone who came out for today's program. Please plan to join us next week, where we will be discussing Hidden Valley Road, Inside the Mind of an American Family by Robert Coker. And I hope everyone has a lovely rest of the week. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.